Thanks for tuning in to our partner webinar brought to you by the National Association of Nutrition Professionals. This webinar is part of our NANP's partnership program, bringing you the latest information, education, products, and services from the holistic nutrition and wellness space. These webinars are recorded from a live event with a Q&A session for the attending audience. We hope you find this information useful and consider including our partners and their offerings in your life.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to NANP's webinar featuring Holistic Consulting with Betsy Miller. I am your host, Tiffany Perry, Development Specialist for the NANP. These webinars are recorded and can be viewed by registrants. We'll send you a link to the webinar recording in the next newsletter. Before we begin, just a quick reminder, this session is NANP intellectual property and may not be recorded or redistributed. You've already heard the video disclaimer. You're welcome to review the written version as well. We ask that you would please hold your questions until the end, and we'll do our best to get to them as soon as we can. Today we present Herbal Safety and Nutrition Practice, Dosage, Interactions, and Individualized Care. Betsy is a registered herbalist and clinical nutrition specialist in Northern Virginia. She specializes in women's reproductive health, including fertility challenges, prenatal care, and postpartum support. In addition to her clinical work, Betsy serves as adjunct faculty in the Herbal Medicine program at the School of Integrative Health, part of Notre Dame, Maryland University. Welcome, Betsy. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So I will go ahead and jump in. I know it's a very large topic, and I'm going to be speaking for about 45 minutes to leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end. But I want to emphasize that this is not an all-encompassing course or overview of herbal safety, because this is such an in-depth topic. So the purpose of today is to really give you the resources to think a little bit more critically about herbal safety in clinical practice. And that includes understanding the way that basic client factors influence herbal safety. So medication use and special populations, understanding why we dose the way we do and how that affects the form and the strength of our herbs and how that impacts the client and the way they respond. Understanding a little bit about herb-drug interactions. That I typically teach as a whole weekend course minimum on herb-drug interactions and really getting into the nitty-gritty of pharmacokinetics and pharmacodynamics between herbs and drugs. And then really understanding how taking a step further in your education into herbal medicine can help you use herbs more safely and confidently in clinical practice. So really, the whole point of today is to give you a foundation for building botanical confidence, because as herbalists and nutrition professionals who have herbal training, we are in the unique position to help both clients and healthcare providers navigate the ins and outs of botanical safety. So from the consumer perspective or the client perspective, since the mid-1900s, when we've had a huge resurgence in the popularity of alternative medicine, many consumers believe that because herbal medicines are natural, they're safe for everybody, despite underlying health challenges or their unique constitutions. Whereas allopathic practitioners or practitioners of orthodox medicine, they receive little to no training in nutrition, much less herbal medicine and supplements. And they typically revert to the idea that alternative medicines like herbs are ineffective at best or profoundly dangerous at worst, and advise their patients to stay away from them simply because they do not have the foundational knowledge to say otherwise. So we as practitioners are in the unique position to walk the middle path and help educate clients around the concept that not all things that are natural are safe for all people. And then also educate the medical community in their language using evidence-based practice for efficacy and safety. So that's really what botanical confidence means, is being able to assess these different aspects, client-specific factors, research and evidence, using clinical experience, and bring those together to walk into clinical practice with confidence using herbal medicine. So there are many client-specific factors. I like to start here because my favorite quote regarding health in general is that it is better to know the person who has a disease than the disease a person has. I know everyone focuses on the let thy food be thy medicine, but I think very much understanding the person, the client, is the most important aspect of clinical practice, whether or not we are a nutritionist, an herbalist, a medical practitioner of some other capacity. Knowing how to read a person is where the magic happens and where the safety happens. So, age, learning how to adjust the dosage of our herbal medicines for infants and children, as well as the elderly, because infants and children are not just small adults. They have very different metabolic processes and ability to handle inputs, just like the elderly. They are more sensitive to inputs. And I have a formula for you on an upcoming slide that I use for calculating dosage based on age for infants and children. Learning how to work with special populations. We're going to talk a little bit today about pregnancy in particular, but pregnancy and lactation, and learning how to, in particular, this is something I really, really emphasize, understand research related to special populations. So I'm going to touch on that as well. Understanding sensitivities and allergies, like individuals who are allergic to the Asteraceae family or the Daisy family or the Solanaceae family, and how that impacts which herbs that we can recommend for a particular client. Knowing how underlying health conditions impact dosage alongside pharmacodynamics and pharmacokinetics. So if you have someone walking into your practice with inflammatory bowel disease, how does that impact the way that they are able to absorb and assimilate not just nutrition, but herbal medicines as well? Does that mean we have to adjust dose for them? What are specific contraindications based on that underlying health condition? Nutritional status. This is a big one. So as we all know, being nutrition professionals, our nutrition status directly dictates our body's ability to process and clear medications. And this also includes herbs. So deficiencies or excesses in macronutrients and micronutrients is going to alter the activity of our liver enzymes. It's going to change our blood protein levels. It's going to disrupt gut function. And this all significantly shifts the balance between a drug or an herb's therapeutic efficacy and toxicity. Nutritional status can also impact the efficacy of our herbal interventions. So, for example, if you want to start working with adaptogens or nervines for anxiety, for depression, for related mood disorders or nervous system imbalances, they will only be able to accomplish so much in the face of B vitamin deficiencies, magnesium deficiencies. So being able to combine your skills as a nutrition professional with understanding nutrient deficiency is going to significantly improve your ability to safely and effectively apply herbal medicines in clinical practice. And this is exactly why nutrition and herbs are the perfect example of integrative health, because nutrition is the foundation. I often say that herbs are pure magic. They are amazing. However, they can only do so much if the foundation of nutrition isn't there. And that's why I've done both paths, the herb path and the nutrition path, because I've seen herbs in practice in the absence of nutrition and herbs in practice in partnership with nutrition. And the client outcomes when that partnership is present are phenomenal. They are so much more beyond what we can get with herbs alone, and they are much safer in practice with nutrition. So the herbs are really that nudge that gets the client to the therapeutic finish line, so to speak. But the nutrition is what sets the stage for that success to happen. Other client-specific factors, medication use. So I have an entire section today where we're going to discuss herb-drug interaction, or HDIs. Our wonderful single nucleotide polymorphisms. I just finished my nutritional genomics class as part of my doctorate program, and just the number of rabbit holes I went down understanding SNPs and how that impacts herb and drug metabolism was fascinating. So we're not going to get too much into the complicated world of SNPs today, but they do absolutely impact safety. And I have one particular example that I'm going to talk about later on in the class. Oops, I want to just touch really quickly on energetics. So this is probably a word that is new to many of you. I practice herbal medicine from a traditional Western perspective. We have traditional Chinese medicine. I don't know much about traditional Chinese medicine. I know that there's qi and it moves and it can get stuck, and that's pretty much the extent of it. There's Ayurvedic medicine, and we do have a system of traditional Western herbal medicine rooted in the four humors of sanguine, choleric, phlegmatic, melancholic. And all that means is every person is unique in their, not just like their energy level as a person, but their tissue states. Some people tend towards dryness, some people tend towards dampness, some people are tense, other people are overly lax. And energetics are a core tenet of herbal medicine that influence safety. And I like to use the respiratory system as an example here, because if we're working with someone whose respiratory system is very hot and dry and they have that like hacking barking cough that you're just like wincing when you hear it, and you give them a ton of cayenne and ginger, and osha, thinking that you can clear all that mucus, you could make their respiratory system much more uncomfortable and much worse, because those are all hot and drying herbs when that person just really needs some soothing marshmallow. So energetics can dictate safety as well from a relationship to the plant's perspective. It's a really, really interesting road to go down when you start studying herbal medicine. So touching briefly on the client-specific factors around age and special populations. So age, there are two rules that I recommend for working with infants and children. So Freed's rule is what I recommend for infants and up to 2 years of age. And Young's rule is what I recommend for children who are ages 2 to 12 years of age. Now, there is a little bit of wiggle room here that I like to, this is where constitution and energetics and assessment come into play. That my children, I make very large, robust, healthy boys. It's my Scottish ancestry. And my 7.5-year-old right now is about the size and size of a 12-year-old. I mean, he's wearing size 12 to 14 clothes. And he is muscular and healthy and vibrant and full of life. So I'm already dosing him with certain herbs at more of an adult dosage and not holding him to Young's rule, because he's healthy, robust, and big, and he is ready for those dosages. My youngest, he was born with a couple of congenital health disorders that I've been treating with herbs since he was 6 weeks old. Despite those challenges, he has always been otherwise robust and healthy. So at 18 months, he was closer to the size of, 2.5-year-olds. So I started dosing him with Young's rule prior to age 2. So this is where assessment skills more dictates these rules. They are not black and white. So we have to apply intuition and assessment skills to these foundational rules. But these are great places to start. And if I had, for example, a 2-year-old who was developmentally behind, a little bit weaker and less vitality, I would stick with Freed's rule for longer until they caught up developmentally to the age of a 2-year-old. With special populations, I teach a whole class on working with women who are pregnant and lactating those populations, because that's my passion, my specialty. And when you are new to using herbal medicine, my rule of thumb is that you avoid the use of herbs, especially in pregnancy, unless they are absolutely needed. There are a few exceptions here. There are always exceptions to the rule for the most part. There's a tea that many of you probably have heard of in clinical practice if you work with pregnant women, called the Nora tea, Nora, which is nettle, oat straw, raspberry, and alfalfa. And that is generally well tolerated. Many, many midwives and doulas use that frequently in their practice to support their pregnant patients. That being said, I have seen raspberry leaf induce uterine contraction in the first trimester that can be really scary, not necessarily harmful, but scary. So I tend to avoid raspberry leaf until later in the pregnancy and stick to nettle and oat straw and alfalfa, because those are food-like herbs. We're going to talk about a spectrum of food to drug coming up. And then if herbs are warranted in pregnancy, if you're working with hyperemesis or gestational diabetes, where herbs can absolutely shift the health narrative, This is where we rely on historical precedent. And I say that because there are very few contemporary studies that evaluate the safety and efficacy of herbal medicine in the pregnant population because it's unethical to experiment on pregnant women. So historical precedent means our materia medicas, our wealth of knowledge from medical experts who were herbalists in the 1800s and prior, who have documented, written, and taught from their clinical experience which herbs are generally safe during pregnancy and which to avoid, like herbs with known emmenagogue activity. Emmenagogues historically were called abortifacients. They stimulate uterine contraction. They are oxytocic. We don't want them during pregnancy. But that is something that you really have to devote time to studying the use of herbs during pregnancy. Lactation, there's a little bit more wiggle room, but pregnancy, we really need to be careful and know what we're doing because there is great room for error there. And then medication use. This is where I teach using clinical judgment based on herb-drug interaction potential. And we're going to look at that in detail coming up. So I am a big proponent of evidence-informed practice. And evidence can mean historical use, so materia medica is what we learned from tradition, as well as contemporary research. And research literacy is something that is incredibly important in herbal medicine and something that I teach at the university and the other programs where I teach because there is a lot more. Did that advance on me? It did. Okay, we'll just go ahead and advance the slide. That's okay. Research literacy, because there is a lot that is done wrong in modern research when it comes to plant medicine. And I'll explain what I mean by that when we get to the herb-drug interaction part. So when I talk about evidence-informed practice, there are some known safety issues that we have to educate ourselves around in order to use plants safely in clinical practice. Understanding the difference between an adverse effect and true plant toxicology is important, and it's a skill that you develop over time as you study plants. So adverse effects, those typically occur at normal prescribed therapeutic doses. They are typically unexpected and usually unpreventable. We don't know it's going to happen. For example, I had a pretty profound adverse effect when I was in grad school studying herbal medicine, where the herbal practitioner I was seeing at the time, part of my program, we had to see an herbalist before we went into our clinical rotation. And I wanted more support for cognitive function. I was tired from being up studying late and felt like my brain was a little foggy. And so she put together a great tea for me that had a bunch of different herbs in it, like bacopa, but it had rosemary in it. And we think rosemary, oh, that's a culinary herb. It's a kitchen spice. Who's going to have a bad reaction to that? I did. So I drank my first dose of this rosemary tea in the middle of class, and I turned bright red, like fire truck red, all over my body. It looked like I had niacin flush, if you've ever seen niacin flush on someone. And who would have expected that to happen? So that was a true adverse effect. Rosemary is not a toxic plant, especially at culinary or tea-based dosages. So again, they are typically unexpected, unpreventable, can be scary, but we can navigate them. Toxic plants or plant toxicology, this is using herbs with known toxicity alongside their therapeutic values. And we do that in clinical practice, the more experience you get with botanical medicine. And we're going to look at a spectrum really quickly that gives an example of what I mean. But this requires careful study of plants, their dosage guidelines, and their impact on those patient-specific factors. I do want to say that many cases of adverse reactions involving herbs are less often caused by true toxicity of the plant than by just the idiosyncratic reactions of the body, like me and my rosemary friend. But it emphasizes that understanding energetics and constitution and underlying health status, why does that keep advancing, is just as relevant to clinical practice as the properties of the plant. So this is the argument, the basis for having as many paradigms as possible to for patient assessment, for client assessment, like energetics. Herb drug interactions. I promise we're going to get to that topic, so I'm going to hold off on that for right now. And then client-based cautions and contraindications. Any known allergies, underlying health conditions. So for example, someone who has a history of gallstones, we have to be very cautious with them in using choleretic and cholagogue herbs like dandelion root that stimulate the formation of bile in the liver and the flow of bile from the gallbladder. This is a text or a resource that I highly recommend. The client-based cautions and contraindications when it comes to herbal medicine, that's what you can find in your Materia Medicas, your herbal monographs. The many textbooks will offer these as well, but I really recommend the monographs instead because those are more based on clinical experience, especially things like the German Commission E. This is available through the American Botanical Council. I will say it's behind a paywall, so you do have to be an ABC member, American Botanical Council, but that's based on the not just contemporary research, but clinical evidence dating back to our old Materia Medicas, our old texts, where they combined energetics with clinical observation and contemporary studies to create a profile of client-based cautions and contraindications. So for example, Cascara sagrada, laxative herb, often used short-term to help with constipation, but there are very specific contraindications for it, like intestinal obstruction, acute intestinal inflammation associated with inflammatory bowel disease, appendicitis, abdominal pain of unknown origin, children under 12 years of age, and pregnancy. So these are the kind of the hard and fast rules about when not to use this plant. And these are best found in monographs like those available on the German Commission E, ESCOP monographs, the European Cooperative on Herbal Safety. That's where I recommend going for those specific plant-based cautions and contraindications for each individual plant that you're learning. So this is one of my favorite quotes outside of the, it's better to know the person that has a disease. So this is from Paracelsus, and he says, poison is in everything, and no thing is without poison. The dosage makes it either a poison or a remedy. And great example here, water, right? We need water to live. We need water to survive. But water at too high a dose and too quickly can be poison, disrupts electrolyte balance. You can die from it. So the same is true for plants, that the therapy versus the poison is typically in the dose. And learning how to dose appropriately based on those client-specific factors is really the secret, the key to unlocking confidently using plants in clinical practice. So when I teach dosage and Materia Medica in general, Materia Medica being the vast array of plants that we have to use as medicine, I like to teach this spectrum of food to drug. On the food side of the spectrum, we have our nutritive herbs that often do have a history of use as foods. So we have oats and slippery elm bark. I like to highlight slippery elm bark as a great example here of research literacy around herbal medicine, because if you Google, slippery elm bark pregnancy, in a lot of cases, you will come up with, do not take slippery elm bark while pregnant. It is an abortifacient. It was used to induce miscarriage. Do not consume it while pregnant. I love slippery elm while pregnant. I used it during both of my pregnancies to deal with reflux and indigestion, and it helps with stabilizing blood sugar because it's an incredible source of fiber. So understanding how to interpret those warnings is the key here, because those warnings are based on the historical use of slippery elm fresh twigs. When you peel the outer bark of slippery elm off of the twig, the inner bark is left super gooey and slippery, hence slippery elm bark. And that twig was inserted by midwives into the cervix to dilate the cervix during early pregnancy and induce abortion. The use is also the medicine. If we ingest slippery elm bark, it is a nutritive food like oatmeal. So learning how to discern those like fear-based warnings around plants is incredibly, incredibly important. So on this side of the spectrum, we have our food-based plants, our nutritive herbs. In general, those are going to be safe for the majority of individuals, including special populations outside of overt allergies and intolerances like allergies to oats. Then we start moving down the spectrum towards food-like medicinal plants, burdock root, dandelion root. They have a history of use as food as well as medicine, but we're not going to eat an entire bowl of pickled dandelion root. I love pickled dandelion root or pickled burdock root. If you've never eaten it, phenomenal. They are incredibly rich in inulin. So if you're working on shifting microbiome, working with dysbiosis and supporting, gut flora, eating pickled burdock root and dandelion root is one of the best therapeutic strategies there. But we're not going to just sit and eat an entire bowlful the way we would with oats. So we're starting to get more down the spectrum of food like medicinal plants, and that dosage, again, the poison is the dosage, is decreasing. If we were to eat an entire bowl of pickled dandelion root, we'd probably end up with very uncomfortable gut, a lot of trips to the bathroom. So our dosage is starting to decrease. We have our culinary spices like turmeric and cinnamon, where we know that cinnamon can help lower hemoglobin A1C. It supports insulin sensitivity, but we're not going to take it in the same doses even that we would do of dandelion root or burdock root. Our dosage is decreasing. We have our adaptogens like ginseng and ashwagandha. For an herb to be considered an adaptogen, it has to be safe for the general population with no significant adverse effects over a long period of use. But again, dosage is decreasing because we are not consuming it at the amount that we would a food-based herb. And then we get into our lowest dose herbs, our gentians, our pulsatillas that often we're taking by the drop of a tincture, not in, even grams of tea. And then at the very other end of the spectrum, we have our isolated compounds like isolated curcumin, artemisinin from our wormwood, digoxin from our foxglove. And these more resemble and have the same therapeutic window approach as pharmaceuticals, as drugs, rather than foods. And I like to give the example here of curcumin versus turmeric. I'm not sure how many of you saw this in the news. I don't know, maybe a month or two ago. I have no sense of time right now with two small children and getting my doctorate. I have no sense of time. But a couple months ago, there was a big story in the news about a woman who got a turmeric supplement from Costco and ended up in the hospital almost to the point of needing a liver transplant. And the supplement that she would, and then everyone started freaking out about taking turmeric. I had, clients email me saying like, should I be taking this? Am I going to lose my liver? It was a fun time. But the supplement that she was taking was a U-theory supplement that was dosing curcumin, isolated curcumin at around, it was 3,000 to 4,000 milligrams a day of curcumin itself. And to put that in perspective, turmeric, the whole root or rhizome, if I'm being botanically accurate, the whole rhizome that we give, including those curcuminoids, we're giving that whole rhizome at a dose of 3 to 4 grams a day, typically. And she was taking an isolated compound. There were likely other factors here, like some of those single nucleotide polymorphisms that made her liver less able to metabolize curcumin safely. But that dose she was taking more closely resembled a high dose pharmaceutical than a whole plant medicine. So this is just the perfect illustration of that spectrum of food-based medicine or whole plant medicine to isolated drug, and why when we're just starting out, studying herbal medicine, I really recommend focusing on whole plant medicine before we get into these lower dose or more drug-like compounds. Okay, herb-drug interactions and evaluating the evidence. This is such a fun topic. I'm going to take a quick sip of my drink here. So there is a lot to unpack with herb-drug interactions. And again, we're not going to unpack it all today because this is a whole course, honestly, in and of itself. But what I like to address with herb-drug interactions is being able to critically evaluate the level of evidence to make informed decisions in clinical practice. So when I think of herb-drug interactions, I divide them into one of three primary categories: clinically relevant or clinically established herb-drug interactions. We have seen this herb impact this drug or class of drugs in a clinical study or in a case report. It has happened and often has happened more than once. It has been replicated. So clinically relevant or established herb-drug interactions. Those are the ones to really familiarize yourselves with. Examples. St. John's wort is probably the most well-known herb for impacting herb-drug interaction. St. John's wort upregulates the cytochrome P450 family in the liver, so it's going to clear drugs more quickly from the bloodstream. So where do we need to be careful with that? With other drugs metabolized by the cytochrome P450 family. Birth control is a great example. Many psychiatric medications, other great examples. There we have to be careful. The narrower the therapeutic window of a drug, the higher the chance of an interaction with the plant. Grapefruit is another example. Grapefruit targets those same cytochrome P450 family enzymes, but it slows down their activity. And then we have the risk of an overabundance or a high level of the pharmaceutical in the bloodstream. Warfarin, another great example. Many of our antiplatelet medications we can use alongside curcumin or turmeric, ginger, red clover, some of our herbs that demonstrate mild antiplatelet activity. But warfarin is a whole animal in and of itself that we have to be extremely cautious with because of its narrow therapeutic window. So familiarizing yourselves with the clinically relevant or clinically established herb-drug interactions. And there's an author, his work is available on PubMed. His last name is Gurley, Gurley. I highly recommend looking at some of his writings because he really goes down the rabbit hole of this clinically relevant information around herb-drug interactions and looking at some of the big ones, St. John's wort, kava, black cohosh. So that is a great resource. So the other two categories that I divide herb-drug interactions into are theoretical, based on pharmacodynamics. This herb and this drug have a similar effect in the body. We've never tested them alongside each other in a clinical setting to see if they interact, but we're going to assume that they do because they act similarly in the body. Or theoretical based on pharmacokinetics. That one tends to be the more probable in many cases, where this herb and this drug are metabolized by the same pathway in the body. So chances are there's going to be some type of interaction. The theoretical here is the key word. Many of those concerns are based on either literally just assumption, pure theory, no even preclinical evidence whatsoever that would happen, or based on in vitro research using an exorbitantly high amount of an herb or a compound from an herb and a drug, or animal-based research, where again, they're typically using a significantly higher amount of an herb or a compound that would represent reasonable human intake. So there's the tool. I have a picture on the right-hand side here from the Natural Standard. They used to be, or Natural Medicines database. They used to be Natural Standard. And they have this like really cool interactions checker, where you can put in all the pharmaceuticals, because the reality is we live in the era of polypharmacy now. Very few clients coming into your practice are going to be completely pharmaceutical free. Many of them are going to be on at least one or two pharmaceuticals. So the era of polypharmacy is upon us. You can put all of their pharmaceuticals into this interaction checker alongside the herbs that you are considering for them. And it will spit back out at you severe, moderate, or mild potential for herb drug interaction. And this is where literacy, the research literacy component, I always bring it back to that, comes into play, because this tool does not discern between clinically relevant, so clinically established interaction, or theoretical. It will even class interactions as severe when, if you actually look at the study they're citing for that severe interaction, it was, 10 grams of curcumin given to a rat at the same time as XYZ medication, and it doesn't represent reasonable human intake. So we still need to think about those theoretical interactions, assess based on our individual clients, what is the potential for interaction here, and make a clinically or a research-informed decision. It doesn't mean that all herbs and all drugs would be contraindicated with one another, even if there are theoretical contraindications there. It means we have to think about what is the evidence for that potential interaction and how realistic is that interaction. When I have a client who is on a pharmaceutical and I'm considering the use of a particular herb with them, and there is a low to moderate risk of an interaction, not clinically established, but based on that theoretical, either pharmacodynamic or pharmacokinetic interaction, assuming I feel like my assessment of them supports the concomitant use of those herbs and drugs, I recommend separating the doses of the herbs and the drug by at least 2 hours. That way they are not in the intestine at the same time, and you are minimizing the likelihood of an acute pharmacokinetic impact between intestinal metabolism and absorption of these pharmaceuticals. And then you want to monitor the patient. So if you want to use, for example, Hawthorne with a patient who is on a blood pressure medication, you need to know that they have to monitor their blood pressure at the same time every day. And if there are trends that blood pressure is going down, then they need to discuss with the prescribing physician their dose and use of that pharmaceutical. Same thing with someone on a metformin or a GLP-1, and you're considering gymnema. They need to be using a CGM, a continuous glucose monitor, or other tool for regularly monitoring their blood glucose so that they are not becoming hypoglycemic. So it doesn't mean that we cannot use herbs alongside some of these drugs, but we have to know how to use them safely. So all of this really comes down to the importance of truly studying the use of herbs so that you can safely apply them in clinical nutrition practice. When we study plant medicine, we learn how to work safely with the special populations like infants and children, the pregnant and lactating populations, so that we can confidently use herbs and minimize the risk. We can go on an amazing journey and deep dive into energetics and constitution and how that informs our choice of herbs. And what I mean by that is when I work with a client for anxiety, I can have 3 different clients come to me with the same, allopathic diagnosis of anxiety, but they're going to leave with 3 very different individualized formulas because they experience anxiety differently. One client experiences anxiety as paralyzing fear. Another client experiences anxiety as anger and outbursts. Another experiences anxiety as circulating thoughts that won't shut off. Those are very different energetic patterns of anxiety, and they require a very different approach from an herbal perspective. And when we study herbs, we can learn how to assess that and create individual client formulas that are true to the empirical roots of herbalism as a form of functional medicine alongside nutrition. And we can learn how to navigate the traditional literature, our old materia medicas and the contemporary research coming out about herbs to create the strongest approach to herbal medicine, which is evidence-based individual client protocols. So when we take that study and apply it in clinical practice, we see the synergy happen and the magic. So a great example is I work a lot with, like I said, women's reproductive health. And one of the conditions that I see most, because I do a lot of fertility work, is what used to be called PCOS. Now it's PMOS, which love that change, polyendocrine metabolic ovarian syndrome. And from a nutrition perspective, I love working with low glycemic Mediterranean diets or periodic ketogenic diets to support glucose regulation, insulin sensitivity. But then we also have combinations like licorice and peony that can normalize the LH to FSH ratio that support maintaining estrogen levels while reducing testosterone levels. We have herbs like tribulus that we can give on certain days of the cycle to stimulate folliculogenesis and support ovulation, especially when fertility is impacted. So again, this is where the nutrition is the foundation because we have to normalize glucose in PMOS, but the herbs really just excel in pushing that protocol further to achieving those client goals. And then we can assess and adjust our formula and the efficacy of our formula based on how our client responds. So if I see someone for PMOS and they're, not responding well to the licorice and peony combination, maybe they need a different approach with angelica or a different herb. So it really helps to be able to assess our not just clients, but the way that they respond to plants on an energetic and physiological level, looking at repeat blood work and being able to use things like tongue and pulse diagnosis from a traditional perspective that really informs how our clients are responding. And that is the basis of not just efficacy, but safety as well. Non-debate. Okay, so if you are interested in studying more down the path of herbal medicine and really stepping into the ability to safely and effectively use herbs in clinical practice, we have an incredible herbal program. It's our foundational training, plus free tools like entire materia medica database that I've been building to help you ground yourself in the tradition, the science, and real life application of botanical medicine. I meant to put my email address here, but it's earthsidebotanica@gmail.com. I can put it in the chat box when I minimize the screen for you all. But we have a great promotion going on right now where you can save $50 on enrollment. You have the code HERB50 right there. And part of this program is live weekly check-ins with myself or one of our other herbalists to really understand the material and be able to incorporate it more effectively into clinical practice. And oh, look at that! 15 minutes for Q&A. I did it.
And I will chime in and say, Sean put a comment in the chat box saying we as in Holistic Consulting also have a robust materia medica on our website that has comprehensive herbal monographs for free. It's a great alternative to the German Commission E.
Yes.
He put that link in the chat box if anyone needed that.
I am putting my own email address in the chat as well that you can follow up with any questions. There we go. All right.
Yeah, see, earthsidebotanica@gmail.com. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to drop these in the Q&A. We wanted to make sure to leave time for you to have your questions answered if you did in fact have them, because that was very thorough. We really appreciate you joining us, Betsy.
Thank you. I love any chance that I get to talk about plants. So it's a fun afternoon for me.
Let's see here, I'm looking. Here's one from Sean. Can you explain the difference between learning herbs, using herbs in your nutrition practice, and becoming a registered herbalist and pursuing clinical herbalism?
That is an excellent question. So learning herbs is something that we all have access to, right? Herbal medicine is the people's medicine. So everyone can learn that elderflower is great for congestion when you have a cold, or taking echinacea, like a round of antibiotics when you get a respiratory infection, can shorten the duration of a cold. Like that's basic kitchen medicine. that you can use to take care of yourself and your family. And that is something that you can learn studying books, using our materia medicas. But then we elevate that to using herbs in nutrition practice, where we look at case studies of actual clients who are struggling with various, health disorders, and how we apply both nutrition and herbs for client outcomes. And then becoming a registered herbalist. So that refers to the American Herbalist Guild. Herbalism is not regulated in the United States. There is no licensure for herbal medicine. There is no governing body of herbal medicine. So we have essentially self-organized into a guild, and there is a registered herbalist status that represents a level of clinical competency, that you have achieved a certain number of hours in herbal education and a certain number of supervised clinical hours as a practitioner to achieve that RH credential. And that really is our highest level of clinical competency in the United States. Great question.
Okay, next question. Can you discuss how dosage considerations differ between teas, tinctures, capsules, and standardized extracts?
Excellent question. So the form of the herb absolutely influences the dosage, but not to the degree that many people think. So if I have let's say I want to do dandelion root, and I want someone to take 1 gram of dandelion root with their meals to support digestion and absorption, I can give that 1 gram as a decoction, meaning they have to simmer the root for 30 to 45 minutes and drink that as a tea with their meals. Or if I have a 1-to-1 tincture, meaning 1 gram of herb is represented in 1 ml of liquid, then they could take 1 milliliter of a tincture before meals and get that same approximate dose as they would with the tea. And I say approximate because our solvents determine what constituents are extracted from plants. So water is going to extract a particular set of constituents, and tinctures that combine alcohol and water are going to extract slightly more. So you might actually have a slightly different phytochemical profile with a tincture than a tea, but you can still accomplish the same relative dose as long as you are using standard measurements. That's why I never take a teaspoon of this, elderflower and make a tea out of it. A teaspoon of elderflower and a teaspoon of dandelion root, totally different measurements, because dandelion root is heavy and dense. Elderflower is light and fluffy. So one could be 10 grams and one could be a ½ gram. So as long as we are staying consistent with grams and mils, you can accomplish the same dose with a tea, a tincture, and a capsule. Standardized extracts, though, is where it gets a little bit different, because those have been, what the word says, standardized to represent a particular constituent amount within that dose. So if we take curcumin and turmeric, for example, if I'm telling someone to take, 1 gram of turmeric as a capsule, just a powdered rhizome stuffed into a capsule 3 times a day for managing inflammation, that's great. If I'm telling them to take, 1 tablet of MediHerb turmeric forte 3 times a day, that's standardized to have a specific amount of curcumin. So you are going to accomplish potentially a higher therapeutic effect with a standardized constituent, or be able to use a slightly lower dose of the whole plant when it's been standardized to have a higher amount of a constituent. So standardization is really where you start getting into the biggest difference between those forms. But teas, tinctures, and capsules, as long as they're not standardized, you can replicate the same dose across forms. And it really comes down to solubility. There are some herbs that make no sense as a tincture, and patient preference.
As nutrition professionals begin incorporating herbs into practice, what are the most common safety mistakes you see, and what systems or processes can practitioners implement to avoid them?
That's a great question. So I think one of the biggest mistakes I see is following, like if you're using pre-made like herbal supplements, is just following the recommended dose on the bottle. And the reason I say that is the dose on the bottle from most herbal manufacturers represents the lowest possible dose that might have a therapeutic effect without an adverse effect in the majority of the population. And I find those, just following the dosage on the bottle to be essentially kitchen sink herbalism, thinking that this dose is going to be applicable to every general person that comes through my clinic. And it doesn't personalize the herbal medicine. And that presents an issue with both safety and efficacy, that in many cases, you're dosing too low to have a therapeutic effect. So that's why we often see people take, 2 capsules of echinacea when they feel like they're coming down with a cold and think herbs don't work because it didn't do anything, because they didn't dose appropriately. But it also presents a safety concern because with special populations like individuals with inflammatory bowel disease or individuals with energetics that don't match the herbs in the formula, we risk aggravating an underlying condition or an underlying energetic pattern. So in order to avoid those types of either lack of efficacy or aggravating underlying health conditions or energetics, it comes down to studying the plants and learning the energetic assessment techniques that match the way herbs are meant to be used, because herbs are really not meant to be used in a you take this for that paradigm. Like, they're not drugs in that sense. They are meant to match the person and the individual health experience and not a disease pattern, if that
That's
makes
a great way to explain that. Well, Betsy,
Yeah.
thank you so much for joining us today and bringing us your knowledge and your enthusiasm on this topic. In addition to thanking you, I want to make sure to remind everyone that this presentation can be viewed via the link that will go out in the next newsletter. Again, thank you so much for joining us today. This looks like this brings us to
thank
the end of our
you.
discussion.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I loved being here. And again, feel free to reach out to myself or Holistic Consulting for any questions. And again, thank you for joining.
You have a wonderful day.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
The information presented in this webinar is for educational purposes only. Please note that holistic nutrition professionals do not diagnose, prevent, treat, cure, prescribe, manage, or heal diseases or medical conditions. They are also not licensed in any state and work with clients, not patients. There are no continuing education credits associated with this webinar.